This is a slideshow brought to you by Sarah Boynton. Botanical jewelry is designed dried plant material. It can be artificially treated and it needs to resemble wearable jewelry. You're permitted to use any flowers, foliage, seeds, etc., and not permitted are artificial, endangered, and locally invasive plant material. Locally is the key word here because if you're doing a show in a different state, you have to check their invasive lists. You're allowed to very lightly coat with epoxy or nail polish or varnish. With the scale of points, GCA design is 35 points, craftsmanship 30, creativity 15, interpretation of theme is 10, and distinction is 10, equaling 100 points. In NGC, the design is 25 points, craftsmanship and technique 25, conformance to schedule requirements 30, and distinction is 20. When you look at the two, they're very different in the interpretation of theme or conformance to schedule. You have to keep that in mind depending on which flower show you are entering to make sure you understand the difference in the points here. You have to follow principle of design, which is balance, contrast, dominance, proportion, scale, and rhythm, as well as elements of design, which are form, light, line, color, texture, pattern, space, and size. Getting started. Read the schedule carefully. I've had this problem before. I entered in Philadelphia a brooch inspired by Dutch pottery and tile. When I went to go mail it, I realized it was called polychrome for the class. I looked it up because I didn't know what that meant, and it meant something that's painted, printed, or decorated in several colors. Well, I had to take out my paintbrush before I sent it and change it because I needed to add color. So I was glad I looked that over before I sent that on its way. I draw my design out with Pages on my Apple computer. It's a program that we have on Apple. If you have Microsoft Word, you might have Publisher, and it's just a way to put shapes together. I just can't draw by hand, so I use the computer program. And what it helps me to do is figure out what shapes and what sizes I need to make my design. And then I go and find material that will help me to make that same pattern. When you're making your designs, you have to have it resemble wearable jewelry, shoes, etc. That means you need a clasp if it can't fit over your head for a necklace. In cases of bracelets, you do need a clasp. It does not have to be a workable clasp. It has to resemble a clasp. Pieces should be accurately scaled. For instance, in this picture is a charm bracelet. You want the charms to fit the bracelet. You want to make sure they're not overly sized or undersized. They have to state in the schedule to have prongs or bezels, which are the part that go around a stone in a design. So here you see we have prongs on the left and a bezel on the right. If it needs it, it will say in the schedule. You do need to hide your mechanics. You are allowed to use wire, cardboard, etc. as a base, but it has to be covered with plant material. So here you see the wire on the left, and on the right it is now covered with plant material. Again, at Philadelphia, I made the mistake of hanging my design with pins. So you have to hang it up. One of the pins slipped, and as you see here, you can see the wire showing, and I was knocked down, so did not do as well as I had wanted to do there. All of the material you see in a design needs to be unprocessed. String, although it's organic, is not allowed because it has been processed. Here's a great example of a beautiful necklace. I did not make this, but unfortunately her cotton knots between the pearls did cause the judges to take a lot of points off. So where do you get your material? I think obviously the best place is to look at nature for your material. Go on your walks. If in fact you go on walks and you find some plant material, one of the things that I recommend, take a camera with you because I like to pick up little nuts and berries and little shells of plant material, but then I get home and I can't remember what plant I got it from. I recommend you take a picture of the plant that you took the material from so that you can help identify it if you do use it for one of your pieces, because you do have to label all your plant material. Rhododendrons are a great source of plant material. Here I use these dried pieces. You can find them right now. And I glued them all together to make a starfish. You are allowed to use different pieces to create something else, like the starfish as an example. Here I used the bud and I dried it so that I could use that in a design, which was very effective, I thought. The other piece that I think people overlook are these tiny little pieces. Of course, all the hort people are going to tell me exactly which part of the rhododendron this is, but it made for a great antennae because it has a little knob at the end, as you can see. Just take it off the plant, spray paint it, and put it on there. They're very delicate, but they're wonderful. I like to use the leaves with a hole punch, and you can take pieces off and glue them in, and they'll be dried by the time you show, and they're very effective as a delicate little piece to this butterfly here. The dogwoods are a great resource. I find these little flowers in the middle here are great to add because they'll give you such great texture to your piece. You can see above there, they have different sizes. Every one of those came from the same dogwood tree in our yard. Early in the spring, you can get a smaller size, and then if you wait a little while, it gets larger. And I like to dry them at different intervals so that you have different sizes. And then I just keep it in an airtight container to use when I need them. Bark is another great resource. You can go out in your backyard and find thin bark is obviously the better part. So I would say birch bark is really very usable. This is a nice thing to use as a backing, as I did here of this particular piece. And that way you don't have to cover it with plant material because it is the plant material. On the right here, that bark is banana bark. It's harder to find, but it is very pliable and it will dry. That was the shape of the butterfly wings there. Pokeweed is a fabulous plant. You can definitely harvest this in the fall, September, October. And what I like to do is go out and I pick them. They're so abundant, so you can get them. Be careful though; they are poisonous, so don't eat them. And put them in silica gel. That's what the silica gel looks like. And you can put them in the microwave, strangely enough, to dry things. Now, if you go online, you can find different times for different flowers to dry them in silica gel on the microwave. I won't take the time now to explain that. But in the case of these, I did 50% power for 3 minutes. And then I let them sit there in the same container for a couple weeks, maybe a week or so. And then I test them, make sure that they're dry. And then I will go and put them in a strainer and keep them in an airtight container with a little bit of silica gel in the bottom, just in case there's some residual moisture. Because if you go and dry these, I've made the mistake of they weren't dried enough, and I go back and they're moldy and it's not fun. And you've lost your wonderful resource for a year. You don't need to use silica gel to dry these pokeweeds. You can also harvest them and hang them upside down in a dry area, and they will dry naturally. It's good to experiment with different drying techniques so that you can get exactly the shape and sizes that you want. But here it is here on this butterfly. This piece is by Mary Presley. Isn't this beautiful? And she used it around her clock here as a nice detail. Here I've used it as a spacer between these pearls. They are very brittle when they're dry, but if you have a small enough drill bit, you can actually drill right through the center and then you can string it on with your pearls. Almonds are awesome because you can shape them. Here you can see that they've been shaped into a heart for a charm bracelet and a gem for a gem necklace. The problem with almonds, pine nuts, and macadamia nuts is there's a little bit of an oil residue on them. If you've ever worked with them, you know. And you need to seal them before you paint them. You can see on the left here that heart. I've actually coated it with epoxy, and on my flyer that you can download, it'll tell you which epoxies I like, and let it dry overnight. And it's got a nice covering. It protects it as well as makes it so that you can paint it. Otherwise, when you go to paint it, the paint will not stick on oily surfaces. Soybeans, I love soybeans because they are, to me, the best thing to use for something that would resemble a pearl. But what I tend to do is drill a hole in the soybean, put them up there, you can see on toothpicks, and that way you can paint them very easily. I use nail polish. Again, it's on that flyer that I have available to you to give you a pearl effect. Now, Andromeda is a great plant. A lot of us have it. You can see the dried parts here look like prongs to jewelry. And I like to use them. Here it is in this brooch without anything in them. I put them in there and then I put lentils on top and paint the lentils to look like diamonds. And it just really looks like prongs with a diamond in it. There's lots of different types of eucalyptus that I like to use. Obviously, we all love the cedar eucalyptus for flower arranging. And I've used it here for the center of the flower and this charm bracelet, the little antennae of the little butterfly, and then just as an accent piece to this other necklace. The cupped eucalyptus, it's a seasonal eucalyptus for us here in New England. And it basically has a divot or cupped area. And it makes for a nice bezel look to different things. I've used it here in this tiara to make it look like there are diamonds all around the emeralds and in the design. This big pod comes around Christmas time. So I used it, and you can add two pieces of plant material together to create a shape that you want. So I used this with a reed, and I sanded it because I needed this pearl to look like it was a pear-shaped pearl I was trying to resemble. Silver bells, eucalyptus, look like shells. People, when I make these into a design, are constantly asking me, how did you get that to look like a shell? Well, I didn't. It comes that way. See this little bell here? Looks like a shell. I've had it in two of my charm bracelets as well as a couple of my necklaces that had a nautical theme. Sesame seeds in big grouping like this are very effective. This looks like the scales of a dragon on this piece. Star anisette, I love this. It's hard to find a really good one, so I like to buy it in bulk. I go to an Asian market and buy it, as you see on the right here, in bulk so that I can find the perfect piece for what I'm looking for. One on the left was a mermaid necklace. The one on the right is a star anisette that has been sanded so that it makes it look like a little flower or star of some kind. So you can do that manipulation to your plant material. One of my favorite things, and I know that it isn't a plant, it is a fungus, but they do allow it, and it's a bracket tree fungus. And when I go through the woods with my dog and I'm walking around, I find them on trees. There's several different kinds. You want to look for the one that is really hard, and you don't have to do anything to it. It's already dried. You can bring it in the house. But one of the things I like to do is sand it down to the shape that I want, and then I like to seal it with epoxy or super glue. And the reason I like to do that is I found that in the past, we all know with cooking, they love to absorb the moisture around them. So although it feels hard, when I went to paint it one time, it just puffed right up. And I know that you need to seal them and make sure they're nice and hard. They won't absorb any moisture. Right here, this little cross was made entirely out of tree fungus with the exception of the shell in the middle. Shelf fungus is another one I like to use. You can take them off. They're wet, they're pliable, they dry very quickly. So what I like to do, if I'm keeping the texture on the one side, I like to put epoxy on the other side to make it form a harder piece. And then you can shape it to look like a shell or whatever you're looking at. Here I put lines in it so that it would resemble a shell, and with the paint you can really see it pops. Mustard seeds alone don't have a lot of effect, but when you put them together like this, I think it's got a very good effect. You can glue them right onto things. Fruit pits of any size are nice to use because they're really hard. They're not going to deteriorate. So this is actually a cherry pit, and I used a little saw to cut it in half, and I put it around the bezel of this particular design for a piece that I did. You can see that it then held a gem. Gives it a bezeled look, and any tree fruit would work. Now, I didn't do this piece. I love this piece. That's why I like to put it in here. But she used corn husks. This is another thing that you can use. And it gives a great effect because of the striations in the material. It made it look like this little miniature dress that she did. Skeletonized sleeves is another thing. Some people say, well, they have been processed by the time they come to us, but I think they're allowed because the skeletonization process is so toxic that I think that they don't really mind if we get them done for us, if you understand what I'm saying. And you can actually go online and buy these leaves. Here she used them for the lace of her dress and put the little gold at the edges and actually gathered them. They are pretty pliable when they're fresh. What a wonderful effect that was. I used it here on the right in one of my fans here to give a lace effect. I painted it black and it just looks like lace there. Again, this is not one of my pieces. I love this. This is from Philadelphia. And I bring this to your attention because she used so many fruit rinds. I thought this was very creative. The flowers and the sea urchins and all these other things are just different parts of fruit rinds you can see. And then the one on the right is actually a cantaloupe rind. I use dried gourds a lot. After the holidays, you can keep your gourds around and they dry on their own. Here's a piece of a gooseneck gourd, and I cut it out with a knife, and then I used a little saw to create the shape that I wanted. And they're very hard. They're very nice to work with as a base. And while you're at it, the seeds of squashes and gourds are very effective. You can use cantaloupe seeds or pumpkin seeds, anything. You've seen pieces along the way that where they've cut out the centers. Now, I did this for a piece. It does take a while. I found that it's easier to use them when they're wet, when they're fresh. So if you go and dry your seeds, I would recommend soak them in a little bit of warm water before you cut out the centers with an X-Acto knife. So yeah, on the left there, I've cut open a cantaloupe seed right in the middle to use for here on this particular piece. You can see all the different sizes I needed for this. Some of them have been cut out, some of them have been halved. The results here in the Maharaja's Jewel, you can see the intricate pieces all around the gem in the center. I did not make this piece, but this is another example of how you can use cut out seeds from cantaloupes and other things. Pine nuts, again, are oily, so remember to seal them, but they have a nice shape to them. I love cloves because if you think about it, they have their own prongs and pearl all in one. And they smell awesome when you're working with these things. Some of these things smell so good. Acorns are good shape for some things. You can use the top or the bottoms. I like to go out in the fall and get a bunch of different shapes. One of the things you have to remember when you're picking up pieces off the forest floor is to realize that a lot of times they have worms or bugs in them. So when I'm collecting acorns or tops or any of those things, I like to put them in the oven on a cookie sheet, maybe a little parchment under there in case there's sap, and bake them for a little while at 200 degrees just to make sure all the little friends are not going to destroy your design. I collected all these acorns one year and I came back to use them and I had not baked them and they all had holes in them. They were just ruined. So just something to keep in mind. White pepper's a great shape for a little pearl. Of course, when you're drilling holes in white pepper, you're going to sneeze like there's no tomorrow, but it still is a very effective shape to use. Macadamia nuts, I love these for large pearls. Again, you can sand them down. They're awesome because if you make a mistake, you can always wipe it down and eat them. And I like to make them a particular size. I put them on a toothpick and then I put a coating of epoxy over them so that they A, stay fresh and don't deteriorate, and B, because of the oiliness, and you can seal them at the same time. Raffia is a very big thing I use often. I like to mix it with a little, I'll show you a video later, but a little glue and turn it so you get these tiny little pieces of neat looking raffia that you can shape into different shapes here, as you can see. Lentils are great for using as a gem inside some of these pieces like Andromeda or crepe myrtle where it looks like a gem. For those of you who go south for the winter or have friends in the south, there's a tree called the Norfolk Island pine, and it is fun to work with. You can go gather these, I guess they're needles, these pieces, and they come in two different colors. You can get them brown or green depending on when they fell off the tree. They fall, you can find them at the bottom of the tree. And I collect them and I keep them in a bin with some silica gel just to keep the moisture down. And then you can soak them in warm water and create whatever shape you want. Here I was making a necklace. And you can use styrofoam and toothpicks, and you shape it in whatever way you want, and it just will dry that way. It's wonderful. Now, they don't come this long. They come in a particular length, and they actually have a tapered down look. So you have to kind of match them up and glue them together. You want a longer piece, but here it is spray painted in gold. It's a very pretty look. I love that. Crepe myrtle, again, if you have friends in the South, unfortunately, where I am, I can't grow it here. But it's a great piece it's a little larger than the Andromeda, and they can hold a pearl, which is a soybean there, to make it look like it's a gem and its prongs. One of the things I like to do is go to Asian markets. Here's one of them near us. One of the things I do recommend, though, I came home with something one time and it was not in English, it was in an Asian language, and I didn't know what I had bought. So I had to go back and get the English version. They do have both packages. It's a really great resource to finding materials because they come in large bags and they do not cost that much. It's also where I get a lot of my skewers to help me glue things. They have different sizes. The other thing I do when and if we get back to having flower shows, I like to take a picture of people's cards that they put down for their plant material lists, because there's a lot of different material that I'm not familiar with because of where I live versus them. And it's a great way to learn of new material. So I like to take a picture of all the different cards as well as the pieces. I think people have such great designs. So these are techniques that I use. If you want to make a pin, like a brooch, in real life, it kind of has a rounded look, so a rounded design. I like to put it on a piece of styrofoam, a round piece of styrofoam that I've cut in half, so that when it dries, it has that round or lifted look. It doesn't lie flat. It gives it a nice look. Making chain links. People are always asking me, how do I make my links? There's two different ways that I do it. First one, I use raffia. This is where I was telling you before. And you knot it and you put it into a drill. I use my husband's drill so often that for Christmas the next year he gave me one. So this is how you get your own drill, because he didn't like having the glue all over his. So you put a knot inside the piece there, and then you use white glue of any kind, like Elmer's or this tacky glue. And I like to put it with warm water so that it's sort of liquidy. And then you knot the other side and you tape it down with some really good tape, so like Gorilla tape or that kind of thing. So then you take the glue and you saturate the piece of raffia because it is rather dry. The glue will do two things. It will keep it twisted and it will make it a little bit more pliable. And see how I have a couple pieces here. If you want a thinner piece, you need to use less raffia, thinner pieces. If it's so thin that it won't stay in your drill, you can actually tie it to a dowel and hand twist it. That's how I do the really thin type of ones. So then you just slowly start using your drill and turning it, and you go up and down the piece like this, getting all the bubbles out because there will be some air bubbles. And when you're happy with how it looks, you tape the other side and you let it dry for a little while. Now again, if you don't feel like cooking dinner that night, you just do this on your kitchen counter and say, I can't possibly cook. These have to dry overnight. It's one way to get dinner out of the day. Once they've dried a little bit, mostly dry, then put them around dowels so that they can shape in the diameter I want. There's another way of making links. Middlino sticks. It's made out of rattan. Oasis makes it. And you can buy it. This is how it looks when it first comes to you. It's rattan, so see how it's really kind of not smooth or anything. You soak it in water till they're nice and pliable. And they have a natural turn to them. See how they're curved a little bit? You find a dowel that will represent the size of the link that you want to make. Secure one end with some tape, like some Gorilla tape. Again, I like the Gorilla tape. And then you start turning it in the natural curve of the sticks till you get to the very end and secure it with a tape. So here's a video of how I do it. I will tell you I will never be a hand model. My mother always cringes when she sees my hands. I guess I need to use lotion more. It's all this antibacterial stuff we're using. I swear I'm so dry. But anyway, here it is. And you curve it around. And you can do these anytime and keep them on the dowels until you're ready to use them. I do different sizes, so I have different things available to me. And then when you want to go use them, they're nice and ready for you. One of the things I want to caution you about rattan, it's a little bit like a mushroom. I've been at shows where someone has used rattan and they made a beautiful piece, and all of a sudden it's reforming a shape of some kind. It's bowing where they don't want it. It was a little bird cage. It was so pretty, but you could see that it was changing its shape. It again will go back to some other natural shape unless you seal it, because when you go to paint it, it absorbs that moisture and then it starts doing its own thing. So when it comes to things like rattan, you want to, put it in the shape you like. And then I like to brush it just a small amount of either epoxy or crazy glue on it with a brush and let it dry, and it will retain its shape then. The tools I like to use, first of all, I can't see anything without my Optivisors. On my website, there's a link to different tools that I use. I don't get any money for it. I just wanted you to see where you can buy it. I'm sure there are other places you can buy it, but just so that you can see where I got mine. You can see on the right there, that's me with one of them on. On the left is a good friend of mine who didn't have them, couldn't see, so she put two of her readers together and had the same effect. So if you don't want to buy one, you can put two glasses on. One night my husband came home and I had my Optivisors on and two pair of glasses on top of my head, and he just looked at me and laughed and said, "Well, I guess you're having a good day." I'm a whirling dervish. She's as neat as they can get, and I'm like, creative and stuff's everywhere. Dremel rotary tool and workstation is one of my favorite tools because it gives you a hands-free way of cutting, incising, making little holes, drilling, everything. And it sits up here on this little drill. It comes in two pieces. You need the drill as well as the drill press. That's how I do my soybeans. That's how I did that little dragon, where you can use little bits to carve out the pieces, like to make the negative space so that you have like a cameo effect. But here it is in action. I have learned to use just my hands, but when you first get started, use flat nose pliers. You can hold a soybean and drill a hole through it. It's as easy as that. A lot of people are intimidated by this. I think just start using it slowly and you'll find that you'll get very comfortable with it. Here's another tool I like. It's called the third hand with tweezers. It's another way of having you do things. Like here, there are three of them holding a piece so that it dries. You can put chain links between it so you can glue them, and it just gives you your hands back. Flush cutters and mini tools. You can go to Michael's or anywhere to get these. The flush cutters on the left, I love those. I really can't express how much I use those, so I definitely recommend that tool for cutting things. People are always asking me, how do I go from a mushroom that looks like this, where you can find it in the woods, to something that looks like this, and ultimately to your piece? See the little triangle there. The tools that I use, I use a belt sander. I take it outside, make sure you have a mask on. Here's a video of how it looks outside, and I use gloves. Sand that big piece down to a thickness that I want where I can cut it. And as glamorous as this piece might look, this is how I look after I've been sanding. That dust all over me, that's not a suntan. Then after you've sanded it down to a thickness that you like, as I had mentioned earlier, you need to put some super glue or epoxy, let it soak overnight. Just brush it on with a cheap brush because you'll ruin it. That way it will get really hard. After you've let that dry overnight, you move on to the jeweler's saw. This is a jeweler's saw with a V-slot bench pin and clamp. I know that's a mouthful, but basically it's a little saw that you can use. You can get different blade sizes. And then this little bench that you clip to a counter of some sort so that you're not cutting into your counter. It just protects where you're cutting. It leaves you space there so that you can cut. When you're cutting, here, this is a mushroom, you can follow a design, and these are such tiny little blades that you can follow very closely. The first cut that I do is just a little bit bigger, and then I'll go back after it's been cut out and get more detailed cutting in there. It saves a lot of sanding time. But as you can see, this keeps it away from your counter and your fingers, hopefully, and it helps you to cut your material. There it is. And so afterwards, when you've cut the material out, here's an example of how they all look in their pieces. Here they are all finished up, pieces of plant material on top of them. Now, one of the things, I know I'm speaking epoxy quite often, but I do like it. And the reason is because you put these on here, you know how often things don't stay glued where you want them. A little light coat of epoxy not only preserves your piece, but helps keep it glued. But often you're gluing something and the epoxy drips down to whatever you have it on. I found that epoxy does not stick onto packing tape. So I'll take a cookie sheet like this and I'll put packing tape down. And then when you go to take it off, it might stick a little, but it will come off very, very nicely. Now, when it comes to sanding, I love to use this type of sandpaper. The higher the number, the finer the sandpaper. So these sandpapers are automotive sandpapers. You can get them at an automotive store, or you can now get them at Home Depot and Lowe's. It can get up to 2,500 grit. I usually use about 1,800 grit. That helps me to finely sand things. It really is a very, like your mushrooms or your almonds or anything that you're sanding. Glue, people are always asking me, what kind of glue do I like to use? Well, I guess it depends on what I'm gluing. My favorite is this super glue gel. We've all super glued our fingers together, so we all know how that is. I've actually super glued my lips together at one point with doing this. I told you I kind of move a little too quick sometimes. But the super glue gel is great because you could put a little glob of it down on some wax paper or whatever you're working with. Use your tweezers and dip your piece into it and then glue it. It glues quickly, but it sort of stays where you want it. It's not as fluid as this crazy glue liquid. Another one I like to use is this up above here, crazy glue with a brush. It's fabulous. I don't know how they do it, but it doesn't get mucked up. It's just sort of like nail polish. It just stays on the brush. I also use the tacky glues quite a bit, depending on if I am in a hurry for it to glue. And then the epoxy that I use, again, it's on that sheet that you can download, is the West Systems. I like to use the 105 resin with the hardeners, different hardeners to do different things. One of them is clear, so if it's the last coat that you use, you want to make sure you use a clear epoxy. There's a new glue, I don't know if you've seen this, it's a UV activated glue. It comes with its own light, and it's quite effective for little jobs. I don't think it's as strong as the super glues, but if you're doing a pave design and you just want to kind of get it stuck in a line or something, I think it's a good example of how you can use it. I just drew a little design just to show you how it used. You put a little drop there. It's pretty thick. It's not too thin, so you can see it. What's wonderful about it is you can get it on your hands. It will not stick to you. The only way it cures is with exposure to this UV light that comes with it. So here's some soybeans put in there. And then you can turn the light on, and it takes about 5 seconds. Comes with it. And you expose it to the light. And there are different brands. This is the one I've used, Bondic. You can get it on Amazon or other places. Now you can get them at the hardware stores. So once it's seen the light, so to speak, it cures. And it does not get sticky on your hands, unless you get it on your hands and get near the light. But It's awesome. You can wipe it off very easily. And it's pretty strong considering. I mean, as I said, it's something to play with. Now, again, with all these glues, one of the things you have to keep in mind, there's a shelf life. Even super glues, they'll dry out very quickly within 6 months. So make sure you remember that and use it accordingly. This is another product I like. It's called Clear Leveling Gel. It used to be called Self Leveling Gel. There's two different names, but now it's called Clear Leveling Gel. Goldens make it. You can get it at Michael's or Dick's art stores. And it's a great product because if you put it on your material, if you paint one coating of your spray paint or whatever you use, and then you look, if it's a little bit on the left here, a little bit rough, I put a coating of this clear leveling gel and it smooths it out. The one problem with this is you cannot sand it afterwards. So if you wanted to sand it, it'll peel off. It's almost a little like rubber cement, if you remember that, where it's not sandable. It'll peel. The other way I use this is if you go outside and you find a leaf on the ground that's all dry and you think, I want to use that in a design, but it's a little too brittle. If you coat it with this clear leveling gel and let it dry overnight, it actually makes it a lot more pliable, and you can use things that are more brittle than you wouldn't have used in the past. Paint that I like, everybody has their own thing here, but I like this golden. Again, I guess I must be a golden fan. Iridescent bright gold fine. I like that for my gold. It's an acrylic paint. It washes off my hands. I can paint it on things. It doesn't smell. Some people like the gold leaf type paints. Those are oil based, but you have to remember when you're painting something, if you mix your acrylics and oils, they don't play well together. They will bubble and they will make a mess. So I would always make sure you test before you put some paint on things, whether it's spray paint or paint you brush on. Because if you're mixing glues and epoxies, I had the mistake of putting gold leaf on top of epoxy and a bunch of other stuff I had to give it a better look because I wasn't happy with the sheen. And thank goodness I started on the back of the pin because it bubbled immediately. So just make sure and do a little testing before you go in there. I never use gold leaf or oil paint because I've had problems, but some people find it very effective. My favorite thing to use overall basically is spray paint because it gives you the best unified and smooth coat. It's very thin. You can put it on lightly. I use the Design Master 24 karat pure gold spray, which is on the left. You can play around with different spray paints depending on what you're trying to do. If it's a more antique look, you might want something little rose gold type look. There are also quite a few silver paints out there. I haven't had as good a luck with silver paint, but when I do need to use it, I find that this Design Master Super Silver is my favorite of all the silvers. For those of you who are not aware of WAFA, which is the World Association of Flower Artists, they have a show every few years. It's 32 countries that are in this organization, and they rotate which country will host the show. And in 2027, it's going to be in Australia, so it's something to consider putting together a trip with your garden club. It's going to be a wonderful show in Australia. 2027. It was in Boston several years ago. I don't know how many of you had gone to it, but it was a lovely show. I did a flower arrangement. I was lucky enough to get second place in my class, but I love the different flower arranging and different materials from all across the world with these 32 countries contributing. And it's something to look forward to. And in Ireland in 2014, I was able to go and I took my mom. It was a wonderful trip. I was very lucky. I earned first place and best in crafts, so all 4 classes. I was really excited, but besides how I did, it was just lovely to see all the different designs that people do. It was in Barbados then in 2017 where I got third place. In 2020, we had it in India right before all the travel restrictions were in place, so it was in early of COVID. I did not place at all, but I did enjoy doing this piece. It was called the Maharaja's Jewel. But I did want to share with you the Indian women who won first, second, and third place because their designs were so unique. I tend to make my designs look very realistic and something that the Maharaja would wear. What they did was very intricate and detailed. The designs were beautiful. The awards were amazing. Now I'd like to just give you a slideshow of different pieces that I've made. If you want to know more about how I made each piece, then you can visit my website, and each has its own designated film to show you how I did each one and the techniques I used. If you are just starting out, I don't want you to be intimidated by some of these techniques. It really doesn't have to be this detailed, but we do get our show schedules for these particular classes well in advance. So you'll have 4 to 6 months to work on it. And you can do a little bit each day or once every few weeks. I just want to encourage all of you to try it. It doesn't have to be as detailed as this. I just tend to spend a little more time than I should on each piece. But I just enjoy the research on how to make these. I do enjoy the research on each class title and just love the process of it. Of course, I love to walk and I love to pick up things along the way. I'm often asked if I ever wear my jewelry. And there will be some occasions that I do, but I will say they're a little scratchy. They're also so lightweight that sometimes I'll wear a necklace as an example and it'll fall off and I won't even notice it. So I tend to not wear them because they are pretty fragile, but every once in a while I'll throw them on. Here's a necklace and earrings that I put on for an occasion. People are always saying, how do we start? Especially during COVID, how can we do something with our club? Well, I would start with a workshop. And what you can do is maybe start with gathering materials, anybody that wants to do this in your club, and just have fun with it. This is a fast forward. Don't worry, I don't work this fast normally. But I gave them an acorn shell that I did have epoxy in just so it was hard, and all this material. And everybody was able to do what they wanted. You can glue your pieces, you can use toothpicks, and see how I glued this just to show you how you could do it. I use this crazy glue at the end because once you've glued it, you want to make sure everything, you just use a tiny little glue to get it in place. This crazy glue with a brush will help seal it and keep it in place. And you can either paint it or not. These are 2 examples of ones that I've done that I painted. One of the things I think is really neat is how creative we women in our garden clubs are. Here are examples of pieces that were done at the workshops, and they are absolutely the same material, and this is the different creativity that they have. Look at how beautiful these are. So I would highly recommend maybe just giving everyone a little cup of materials and having them do their own thing, and then do a botanical arts show with your club. One of the things our club did was we voted on photography shows. We've done it twice. You could do it like that for your shows. You can do pins and have each of them take their own pictures, submit them, and people vote on them. Or don't vote if people don't want to be judged, so to speak. But I hope you've enjoyed this show, and I hope I've inspired you to go out there and have some fun with this. In closing, I'd like to invite you to go to my website, sarahboynton.net. If you have any questions, please email me. I'd be happy to answer them. If you'd care to share any of this information with your clubs, please feel free to download anything you need. I hope you stay safe. Take care.